Good evening. I'm Diane Lewis, the Chief Programming Officer and EVP of the Paley Center for Media, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our discussion tonight on a topic that is incredibly relevant as we head into another presidential election: social media and the public square, balanced or biased. Tonight marks the 7th annual program of the James P. Jimirro Media Impact Series, all thanks to an incredibly generous gift from Jim, who was the creator and founding president of the Disney Channel and Walt Disney Home Video. The James P. Jimirro Media Impact Series casts a special light on the role of media in influencing thought and behavior. This series is organized to engage the Paley community, industry professionals, students, and the public at large, and to encourage a more thoughtful, critical conversation with the media. Never before has Paley's mission been more vital, as media has been the undisputed connector to a nation in unprecedented times. Paley is uniquely positioned to meet this moment with impactful conversations led by thought leaders such as the respected journalists and political strategists joining us tonight. With the 2024 presidential race well underway, ahead of next year's election, and with more than 70% of people now getting their news from social media platforms, our panel tonight will discuss the role of social media in political discourse. It will look at social media's influence on the 2020 presidential election and what's in store for 2024, especially given the rise of AI and the major changes among many of the top social media platforms. To help us start the evening, I am honored to welcome somebody whose conversation I enjoy all the time, our dear friend, Jim Jimirro.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 7th edition of our Media Influence program here at the Paley Center. When I first proposed this idea to Paley, I was thinking about the so-called legacy media, newspapers, magazines, radio, television, and indeed we have had several fruitful discussions on this stage about the remarkable influence of these media. But all this time, something else was happening, and not just evolving or emerging. The only proper word to describe the phenomenon of social media is that it simply materialized. Indeed, the gathering power of social media has been so rapid that in the wink of an eye, it appeared and then dominated before we had a chance to understand it or wisely respond to its implications. It has been well established that most of all the legacy media players have a worldview and a corresponding narrative that they promote. In a simpler time, it was quaintly called bias. And it generally takes two forms: slanted coverage and suppressed coverage. In many ways, the second of these is the most insidious. This is an overarching issue of social media. Since they are the consummate gatekeepers, how do they approach in the public arena of politics and policy the thorny issue of what to publish, what to block or suppress, what to remove? Who makes these judgments, and are they fair and even-handed? And what about the freewheeling public square? One that those who established speakers' corners in Hyde Park in London and Union Square in New York could have never contemplated. How do we begin the process of understanding this phenom and figuring out how it affects our culture, our politics, and our society at large? Again, the open-air public squares in London and New York have never had gatekeepers. In the digital public square, of course, gatekeepers abound. How does that change things? And do any such changes have the capacity to alter the very destiny of our cherished republic? And of course, there's artificial intelligence, a subject of overriding significance in and of itself. In the early days of television, when we were trying to understand the wide-ranging implications of that phenomenon, a wise professor from Syracuse University asked the question, who can see television steadily and who can see it whole? Not a bad query to be posing right now. While the subjects are controversial, these are eminently worthy questions. And because of the polarization of our culture, there are no easy answers. But by assembling a balanced panel, as we have for this evening, I think it is possible to get to some truth, especially for any auditors with an open mind. So again, thank you for joining us this evening, and I would like now to introduce our moderator for tonight, Mark Lukasiewicz.
Hey, everybody. Thank you, James. Thank you, Diane. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We're looking forward to a really interesting conversation on a really interesting topic, and we have an amazing panel for you, and I want to get right to them. So I'm going to introduce them now one by one, and I'm not going to ask you to hold your applause because I think all of them deserve a great round of applause. So starting, he is professor of politics at NYU. He's co-founder and co-director of the Center for Social Media and Politics in their lab. Please welcome Joshua Tucker. She is politics reporter for Vox Media's The Verge. She covers news at the intersection of tech, politics, and business. She's our working journalist in politics out in the field every day, McKenna Kelly. He is vice president of Media Research Center and Free Speech America. Please welcome Dan Schneider. She is opinion editor at Newsweek, author of a book entitled Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. Please welcome Batya Ungar-Sargon. He is vice president of the Cato Institute, a political theorist. He wrote Why Government Should Not Regulate Content Moderation on Social Media. And crucially for our discussion tonight, he's a member of the Facebook Oversight Board. Please welcome John Samples. And she is what she calls herself a practical conservative, a commentator on CNN, and I dare say among all of us here has the biggest following on social media with 500,000 followers on X. Please welcome S.E. Cupp. So thank you all for being here, and I hope we'll have a fruitful conversation and go in as many directions as you care to go. I'm going to start with something that candidates hate at a political debate. I'm only going to do it once, but by a show of hands, who here believes right now as we sit here today, social media is a net positive for America's political discourse? That's very encouraging, and I knew Joshua was going to answer that way. So Josh is a social scientist and has arguably been involved in more research on this topic than anybody else in the country, and has been involved in two major studies, right? Twitter a few years ago, and most recently Facebook and Instagram. And I wonder if you can share with us, you found some interesting findings about the role of algorithms, and you found some interesting findings about what it means to what people do, their behavior ultimately.
Yeah, thanks so much, and thanks all of you for being here tonight. So yeah, I was involved as one of the co-academic leads of what's known as the US 2020 Facebook and Instagram election study. And this was a first of its kind collaboration between a large team of academics and researchers working at Meta to try to design a set of studies in the lead up to the US 2020 election so that we would have answers to the types of questions that we were left with after the 2016 elections. We had two different types of studies that we carried out on these, in these elections. One were what we called observational studies, which is when we were able to get access to, at the aggregated level, information about US adult users of Facebook and Instagram in the year around the 2020 US elections. The others were experimental studies, and these were experimental studies with consenting participants where we were able to, by working in conjunction with the platform, alter aspects of their platform experience and then randomly assign people to have these slightly different experiences on the platform and compare them to a control group that had the normal experience. And so what this did was it allowed us to get at, in a kind of very precise manner, some of the big picture questions that we've been talking about, that people have all these questions about what can be the impact of social media. So we were able to do, in the first 4 studies that were published this summer, we were able to look at things like the algorithm, which everyone talks a lot about, by randomly assigning some people to go back to what's called reverse chronological feed, where you just see what you have seen, what the most recent stuff posted by people you follow, or pages you follow, or groups you follow, as compared to the engagement maximizing algorithm that's in use in the platform, was used at the platform at the time. In another study, we tried to look at the subject of virality. This is a big thing that people talk about with social media, the speed at which things spread through social media. So we had a treatment group of people who were not exposed to reshared content. It's not a perfect measure for virality. Some stuff goes viral with organic posts, but it's a pretty good measure. A lot of stuff goes viral with reshared content. And in the third one, we looked at this big picture question of echo chambers, of trying to look at, well, what happens? A lot of people have pointed to the problems of people go online, they're surrounded by people politically similar to them. And so in that study, we reduced the amount of content that people were seeing from people who were politically similar to them. What we found across these studies was threefold. Across all four of the first 4 studies that came out, there were sort of 3 big pictures that came out of it. One, making these tweaks to what was going on the platform actually did have a big impact on people's on-platform experience.
What they saw.
Yeah, well, what they did, what they engaged with, it had an effect on what was going on the platform, and sometimes in ways that we wouldn't have expected. To give one example, when you put people into reverse chronological feed, people who were in this treatment on Facebook started using Instagram more. Right? People who were in this treatment on Instagram started using TikTok more, right? So we saw these kind of big changes in what happened to people, what content they saw on the platform, and what they were doing on the platform. The second thing we found was that there was a high degree of ideological segregation on the platform. So for example, in that study about like-minded content, we found that for the average Facebook user, about 50% of the content they saw came from people who were politically similar to them. And only about 15% came from people who were politically cross-cutting from them. So if you were liberal, only about 15% came from conservatives, and about 35% came from moderates. So we did find this kind of segregation on the platform. However, the third big finding across these papers so far is that despite the fact that we saw these changes on people's on-platform behavior, despite the fact that there was this ideological segregation on the platform, we did not find any significant effects, downstream effects on people's attitudes or behaviors. So we didn't find, in particular, any effects on people's levels of political polarization. Now, there's a lot of important caveats here. These were 3-month-long experiments. They were done during the heat of an election campaign when people were getting tons of information from lots of sources. They were done on one platform. They weren't even changing everything about the people's platform's experience. But those were the 3 big findings that came out of the first of this. There's more papers to come in the coming year or so where we're looking at other aspects of this here. But it was a really exciting opportunity to actually be able to inform the public about what we're learning from these platforms and be able to get at some of these kind of big causal questions.
So one of your collaborators sort of boiled it all down to facts don't change attitudes, right? Brendan Nehan, I think, said that as part of the study a little bit. But here's what I want to ask SE, which is what Josh just laid out, does that track with your experience? That the algorithm changes what people see, but at the end of the day, the various changes we've seen in social media don't necessarily impact people's attitudes?
Well, I trust science. Absolutely. My experience belies that a little bit. And I think that's because the nature of social media is, and I'm coming at this as a journalist, which is a particular kind of user of social media, but the nature of it is such that accountability is really tough to enforce and come by. And that manifests in a couple of ways. One, the anonymity that social media can allow. 2, the immediacy that social media allows. And the speed with which you can just share thoughts. The brevity, right? Maybe 240 characters on Twitter or 90 seconds on Instagram. All of these things make it really easy to put your opinion out there, which is great, but not be very careful with it. When you're anonymous, when you can do it quickly, when you don't have to think about it, when you don't have someone sort of standards looking over and making sure this, and this are correct. And it can go really fast, and then you get it affirmed or challenged, but usually you get it affirmed. The algorithms want you to feel affirmed. And I think that can change people's polarization. And let me tweak that, because it might change their perception of polarization. Maybe not actual polarization, but the perception, it's false, is that everyone agrees with you and that everyone you know is mad at the same people. And there's a divide that's like these people and maybe nothing in the middle. Mm-hmm. We know that's not true, but I think it can trick you into thinking, again, I'm coming from a political journalism point of view. I'm not talking about like skincare TikTok, which I love. But it can trick you into seeing the world in a different way than it is. The same way cable news can trick you into thinking there are people here and there are people here and no one in the middle. I don't think that's real, but I think it creates a perception that might be problematic and not representative.
Batya, I want to ask you a question. So I think you raised your hand saying social media is a net positive for the political discourse. You've written a very provocative book in which you, if I'm summarizing correctly, essentially say that legacy media, mainstream media, is part of the elite. It's sitting up there alongside the government elite and the corporate elite, and that disempowers the middle class, the working class, and that social media is an avenue for those Americans to find a voice when they're shut out of other conversations. Is that a fair summary, and can you talk about that?
Well, I actually think that social media is one of the three areas as an industry that benefits from polarization and contributes to the false impression that Americans are polarized. I am a huge polarization skeptic. I just think that the polling, as well as I just spent the last year traveling around the country interviewing working class Americans for my next book, people are so totally more united than divided along political lines. And I think most people who are not benefiting economically from polarization know that. Mm. So working class people do not have the luxury of hating people who they disagree with politically. They're not benefiting from it, but B, they rely on them in a physical way in their jobs. So polarization exists in the elites. It exists in politics, because obviously, if you can convince people that your political opponent is a groomer, right, you don't actually have to deliver for your constituents because no one's going to vote for the groomer, right? Like, you could see how it works. It's very obvious how it works. To polarize people in politics, you easily consolidate power that way. It's happening in the media as well. The media gets a lot of its power and it makes money off of this myth of polarization because the media itself has become very divided. Now, I argue in the book, the main claim of my book is that what looks like a political divide is actually a class divide between a college-educated elite that's in the top quintile and everybody else, the rest of this nation. And those elites, they get a lot of power and they make a lot of money off of that, the illusion of polarization. And of course, social media does this. So what I tell people all the time, and this is actually true, it's not an exaggeration, every time you get enraged at a stranger on the internet, somebody in Silicon Valley just made $1 million. Mm-hmm. Like, it is not natural to hate a stranger in that way. And most people really don't, or if they do, it is ephemeral. They're on, Facebook, they see the 15% that they disagree with, they're like, "Oy," and then they go to church with someone who has that view that they don't agree with, and they just don't care. I mean, it's just so I think the companies themselves are actually making a lot of money off of the illusion of polarization. But it's just amazing what Twitter allowed to happen was for people to see how petty and small the people who pretend to be experts and authorities on things actually are, and how thin-skinned they are, and how ridiculous they are. And I think that is, we're living in a moment where the wisdom of the crowd, the wisdom of the people is really shining through the illusion of the wisdom of the experts who have really dropped the ball again and again and again. And certainly that's true, I think, in the media.
Okay. Dan, let me ask you, I suspect your analysis is a little different. But I'm curious, I think you've posited that mainstream media, even though we're all talking here about not the dominance, but the importance of social media, that mainstream media still kind of calls the shots in terms of liberal mainstream media, in terms of setting the agenda for media coverage in the country and by extension in what happens in the public square. Is that a fair?
Yeah, we've seen a couple big changes in recent years. It used to be that the New York Times would set the agenda on most issues. The Washington Post would set the agenda on political issues. People at the networks and other news outlets would take their cues from those two main publications, and that was the end of the story. Politico came along, some other media outlets came along that have now participate in helping to set that agenda. And then comes the social media companies. I would say before 2016, look, the big social media companies have always been run by liberals. That's not in dispute. Their party affiliations are known, their political contributions are known, their statements are known. But their political views did not have much of an impact on the direction of their companies. That changed at the end of 2016. Eric Schmidt had, the executive chairman of Google, had moved from California to 2 blocks from Hillary Clinton's campaign, and he was her chief political tech advisor, and several executives from Google followed him to New York, and they all assumed she was going to win. And it was a real shock to most people, including myself, that she did not. And Eric Schmidt, right after the election, I actually wrote this down, said how people get their information, what they believe, what they don't believe, is the project for the next decade. This has been his mission, to use Google to change what people know to be true, to change how they approach truth, to change their reaction to it. And he's been pretty successful at that. We've seen the data that shows how Google manipulation of search results changes how people vote, 8-9 million people. We've done our own studies that show how Google buries information. I mean, just right before the Republican presidential debates of last week, right? We did 2 interesting searches in Google. Democrat presidential campaign websites. And Google produced Joe Biden right at the top, Marianne Williamson, but no RFK Jr. He was completely eliminated. When we asked the same question for Republican presidential campaign websites, we again got 2 search results. Marianne Williamson again, and then the person scoring 0 in the polls, Will Hurd. But there was no Donald Trump, no Ron DeSantis, no Nikki Haley, no Vivek Ramaswamy, no Tim Scott. Yeah, and we've been doing this for quite some time, and the search results remain the same. We've done several of these things, and I know I'm picking on Google because I think Google's probably the most effective at controlling and manipulating information. But this is a problem. Yeah, the media takes its cues still from the Washington Post, the New York Times, some Politico and some others. But then the social media companies shake that information out in ways they prefer.
So John, you've expressed the view that government regulation is not the way to go to deal with what some people perceive as problems with social media and disinformation on social media. But you're an original member of a very interesting exercise that Mark Zuckerberg launched of the Facebook Oversight Board. So you've seen some of what has been challenged on what is unarguably the biggest social media platform in terms of reach and scope in the world by far. Sure. Has that been effective?
The Oversight Board?
Right approach? Yeah, do you think it's the right approach?
I think the Oversight Board does 2 things. It acts kind of like a court where you have cases, decisions are made. The most famous case was Donald Trump's removal or the suspension of his account on January 6, 2021. And you decide, according to various kinds of standards, whether that holds up. And if it doesn't, Meta will return the content to the platform. And they may also make other changes that are similar throughout a platform that has 3 billion people on it now and has increased by 100 million, I think, in the last 6 months or so. And I would say right there, that's only part of what we do. But remember, the other thing is, it's 3 billion people, right? And they are posting content every day. So it's always going to be a large and increasing non-human element in doing content moderation. It's also the appeals process itself is going to be like that. It's going to be huge and essentially very difficult, I think. I think it has had an effect in, I think I would say in the time I've been on that, there's been a general social trend away from freedom of speech. And to some extent, I think I would see that at Meta, or Meta's now Facebook is now Meta. And that's because there's a lot of talk in society about safety rather than freedom of speech. And so you see some of that. The other thing the Oversight Board does is recommend policies, and the policy recommendations are not binding. So Meta can turn them down or not, and sometimes it's because of technical reasons. But I think they've been responsive, and candidly, I would say I'm not sure how much change has been in that direction. So in general, I would say I'm fairly happy in how well the Oversight Board has done in supporting stronger freedom of speech protections than would have otherwise happened in an era when really, we're going through, one of my friends calls it a kind of free speech recession, right? Mm-hmm. And so you have to judge it by that, right? Mm-hmm. The entire society is going the other way. And recessions end, folks. Recessions end and you have growth again. So I suspect, I hope we will make our contribution to bringing about a rapid free speech growth period, right?
Mm-hmm. McKenna, I want to get to you and apologize, but I'm curious, any comment you have on what you've heard, and also I know that you're a field reporter in politics, and you have a particular interest in / concern about perhaps artificial intelligence as that becomes a bigger and bigger part of our world, including in social media.
Sure. So actually, I'm hearing a lot of things on this stage tonight, but the one thing I'm hearing the most of from you doing these search engine reports, doing that, from you hearing about the way that people actually feel, working class people, and then also what I'm getting at is that with Facebook, other platforms, we would have a lot better answers here tonight for you if they were more transparent with what they're doing. And I think that's why your study, which I got under embargo and was so excited to read, mind you. I would recommend everyone here actually go and read those studies because they are actually groundbreaking. The fact that we actually have academics looking at the algorithm, playing with it. We need more of that. That's what we need more of. Because we talk about maybe us as journalists are the elite, we are trying to, decide where the narrative is going on things. When it comes to social media and reporting on algorithms, we rely on anecdotal evidence. It is not the best resource to use for this. So when it comes to Facebook, Twitter, X, whatever, and any other platform, we need more transparency into how they work. I also think the Oversight Board has been great to even hear about those conversations, right? About what is wrong, what is right, the path forward for these platforms. So what I'm hearing tonight, and I think would solve a lot of our issues that we're having right now, is a little bit more transparency into what exactly is going on.
Mm-hmm. So I don't think anybody up here necessarily would advocate for the government to get involved in regulating social media content, but do I hear potentially some votes for disclosure requirements, the same way corporations have to report certain facts and figures? Would some data disclosure requirements from social media make you happy?
Yeah, no, this is actually a fantastic question. And the study that I was able to tell you about tonight and that we were able to share these results, this happened because, call a spade, right? Facebook let it happen. And that's great that they did. They should get kudos for doing this, right? They took risks and they invested a lot of time and energy into it. And now we as a society know way more than we will ever know about what happened in 2016. But I think that's exactly the question we need to be asking right now. We've seen what's possible. We've seen that it is possible to do this kind of research with safeguards to ensure that it's rigorous scientific research, right? We did all sorts of things, which I'm happy to talk more about in the weeds, to protect the integrity of this research, because we knew we were collaborating with people who worked the platform we were studying. So we did things like what's called pre-registering our results. We said before we got any data, what it is we were going to report afterwards. We did things where the academic teams we stood up for this, where the academics were going to be the lead authors on the papers who had the final say after making sure that there was no legal or privacy concerns violated, and with feasibility of what studies were able to do, on what we're going to be in these pre-analysis plans and what we're going to be in the actual article. So we put lots of safeguards in there, but we now know this is possible, right? And it's possible that if we continue down this road, this will never happen again, right? So I think this is a question, now that we know this is possible, what we as a society want to be saying is, should this only happen when someone at the platforms decides it's an okay idea? Or is this something that we want to demand as a society that we know? We looked at a piece of the information ecosystem here, right? We did not look at what happens on TikTok, right? We did not look at what happens on Google in this particular study. But we did show it's possible to do these kinds of things, right? And we looked at this in one country, in the United States. There are people around the rest of the world, I think, who are very curious of what happens. So the question is, we live in a world, and maybe there are some people here on the stage who are not happy about this, but we live in a world where we say, hey, banks have to be subjected to stress tests, and those have to be reported out. Or companies have to be talking about how much pollution they're emitting as part of these things, or safety tests, or drugs need to be tested before they can be brought to market. I think it's a very legitimate question to ask, right? With products that are used by so many people for so much time, what right do we have as a public to know and understand the answers to these questions? So in my mind, I think I've written about in this book that I co-edited with Nate Persley at Stanford called Social Media and Democracy. We talked about, look, if we want to know the answers to these questions, there's three options. You can work with the platforms and try to do it in the safest and most rigorous way you can when those options present themselves. You can work without the platforms, but don't kid yourself. Even if you're working around the platforms without the platforms, you're still kind of at the mercy of the platforms to not change things and not make it harder to do that research. It just got, for example, it got immeasurably harder to do studies on Twitter.
Yeah.
Researchers have been studying Twitter because they've been so
X.
Yeah. Oh, X, yeah. I think it was Twitter when it got harder to do studies on it. But researchers have been learning a ton about this for years and informing us on issues way beyond politics, right? Like things like mental health of children. Well, it just became much harder to do this.
So John, I know you wanted to weigh in, and then Dan.
So I wanted to talk about the disclosure. Actually, a government has moved, or a government of sorts, has moved on disclosure. The European Union has passed a Digital Services Act that at the end of August compelled all the major platforms to disclose a great deal of information. It's fairly clear, at least to me, that the Digital Services Act it's a weird kind of European thing from an American perspective, which is, it's a law, but it's not really a law. It's actually a law that mandates a process for making laws later, is I think what it's going to be. And the concern I would have about that is that given also that companies like Meta have have a strong preference for single rules across the entire platform, because that helps with the machines, is that whatever the European Union rules become, which will be European free speech codes, will be applied throughout the world, including the United States. So it's not crazy at all, though this is going to sound crazy, that in 2 or 3 years that everyone in this room on Facebook or any major platform will be living under European speech codes, right? And so you have to ask
God forbid.
God forbid. Do you know anything about European speech codes? It's not the First Amendment, baby.
Yeah. Dan, you want to say something?
Yeah, well, you preface this with, should they be regulated? Maybe nobody would agree that they should be. Well, they are, right? The Federal Trade Commission oversees deceptive trade practices. So do state attorneys general. Antitrust review is going on right now. The Department of Justice has brought an antitrust case against Google, and there are several concerns about Apple and Google and Amazon, whether they're in violation of antitrust law. Section 230 is supposed to shield these big tech platforms from liability unless, and that unless is a big open-ended question. Florida and Texas have passed statutes that do not permit these big tech platforms to censor constitutionally protected speech. We're now at a stage where I do see these big tech platforms manipulating information, not allowing the American public to actually have access to quality information. And that is disruptive to a democratic system. Our whole system of government is that each of us is to participate in this American experiment of self-government. But that only can take place if we have access to information. And when we've got a handful of people deciding what information should be accessible and what information should be hidden, like the campaign websites of several candidates on both sides of the aisle, that becomes a real danger. And if these big tech platforms do not reform themselves, they will be reformed. And with the loss of a speaker, a possible replacement would be Jim Jordan, who has legislation in mind to reform Section 230. So they are already regulated, and there's more to come, whether it's from Europe or whether it's from states in America or the US Congress.
But if there are those who would say, well, there's the country is engaged and the platform is engaged in cancel culture, in banning voices or pushing down voices they don't like. But is there room for more things like the Facebook Oversight Board with real teeth to deal with real disinformation, which, after all, still does exist on these platforms?
Let me quickly say, of all the big tech platforms, I think Facebook has tried to do the best at honoring free speech. I was highly skeptical of the Oversight Board when it was populated because I didn't think that there were enough Americans, and America has a unique First Amendment standard. But I'll tell you, I've been pretty impressed with some of its work in recent months.
I have to say, though, we've seen a development over the last year at least, I think, John, that Facebook is walking away from news. Facebook made a serious investment in news. Campbell Brown was employed to run news and news partnerships and invest in news product. And Campbell announced her resignation from the company the other day. The money is gone, and it seems like Facebook has just decided it's more trouble than it's worth.
Well, I mean, at the height of the political news feed, that was said that it was more trouble than it was worth. There wasn't a great deal. I mean, there's a lot of things in the world that Facebook does that's more trouble than it's worth. I mean, where they are and so on. I do think, well, the question you need to ask about disclosure and also about, there's one thing actually, and only one thing that would be vitally important to disclose. And once you know that, you know everything, which is these machines that seek out, they don't wait till people report it, they seek out violations of Facebook's rules, which are their rules, and then they have a problem of trying to identify, because they're looking at 3 billion people and because it's a common filtering problem, which is that these machines make mistakes. So if you have hate speech or whatever violation you have, and you want to say, how sure do we have to be that this is an actual violation, and how sure, what is the chance that this just happened by chance? And one idea in the social sciences, one of the ideas there is that you have a 95% certainty that what you've got. So that trade-off and how certain you want to be is the whole ball game, because all of these machines are calibrated that way. So if you make that a public factor, right? So if you want more hate speech taken down, you want more mistakes being made about free speech, you'll change it to 90% or 80% certainty. Someone will try to control that, and the question each of us have to ask, this is the question of public choice. You can't just talk about things. It's about what is the actual way governments make choices. Who's going to calibrate that, and how are they going to calibrate it? And would it be better than the company? Or will you conclude we're better off, whoever we are, for you, we're better off with the company.
Essie, where do you put yourself on that question as a journalist?
Right, so there are a couple of things sort of in the fiber of my DNA. I went to Cornell University many years ago and worked at the school newspaper. It's one of the last remaining independent college newspapers, meaning there is no oversight from the university. It is run by students. That experience made me very skeptical of oversight and regulation. And as a journalist, everything I did after that was really, I carried that with me. It's hard because you, as a news consumer and a social media user, you want these platforms to be good, you want them to be effective, you want them to amplify your voice, you want to learn about other people's voices, and you wish you could filter out all the that comes with that you didn't choose. Whatever that is, you didn't choose it. And one of the things I like to say about this is that some of that onus is on us as consumers. There's only so much that an oversight board or machines, they can't catch it all, and they can't catch it all correctly. But I liken it to a grocery store. You go into a grocery store with intentionality. You know what you need, generally speaking. Maybe you're open to some other things, but you go in knowing what you need, you're there for that, and when you get to the checkout, you pay for only the things you want. When you go on social media, if you're not intentional, if you're not there for something and you know what you're there to get, lots of other things can hop in your cart. Maybe some things that you didn't know you want, but you do. And definitely some things you didn't want and you weren't there for. And that's part because the algorithm is very responsive and it could be stronger than your desires and intentions. But when we go on passively, which a lot of us do, I mean, I go on Twitter because I'm bored waiting in line for a movie or whatever it is, then you get a lot of stuff you don't want. And I think we have to become better social media and news consumers. And that requires a lot more intentionality. And I think then that affects algorithms. Then that affects companies and corporations and oversight boards. And that relationship has to be symbiotic. If we're just passively sitting here hoping social media figures it out and improves itself of some kind of altruistic, desire, I think we'll be waiting a long time and we won't get a product that can be very good and useful.
Batya, when I was talking to you before this panel on email, you made a point that if the answer to someone saying something ridiculous on Joe Rogan's podcast is that person has the capacity to go look it up, right? And figure out what's truth or falsity. But in the class that I'm teaching right now at Hofstra, one of the things we are talking about is how do you determine truth from falsity in a world full of AI, full of things that look like fact that aren't. Is that giving too much credit to people's both willingness to do it and not be casual and ability to do that kind of activity, to really sort the wheat from the chaff?
Right, so a couple of points. I mean, the first is, I think, we're talking about social media as if we're the consumer of social media, when the truth is we are actually the product, right? When something is free, you're not the consumer, you're the product, right? Our attention is being sold to advertisers, right? That's the business model, right? So a lot of the policing that happens on these social media companies is because an advertiser does not want their ad to appear next to a swastika, right? It's not because these people believe, it's not because of free speech, it's because of a business rationale, right? So we get these free products, we get this free app, and we think that we're the consumer, right? We're like, oh, look, I'm going to post how I'm feeling, and I'm going to see all my friends and whatever, when actually your attention is being sold to an advertiser, right? So we're the thing that's being sold, right? We're not the actual consumer. I think that's really important to point out. I think it's also really important to point out that, so the main difference, so SE, you posted a video on your Instagram and you said, what should I, what do you want me to talk about on this
Tonight,
panel?
yeah,
Yes.
right.
And one of the questions was really good.
Tell me.
This guy, he said, how come when media people and journalists who get paid to do it, how come when people are get paid to give their opinion, it's called media, but when people do it for free, it's called social media? And I thought that was really great because it got to something much deeper, which is that there is this illusion of authority, right? Like we journalists believe somehow that we should have authority, and there's this fantasy that someone's gonna watch me on TV and hear what I said, and then they're going to know who to vote for, right? Or they're going to know what the truth is, right? So we have that illusion. That is not how people consume the media, but it's definitely not how they consume social media. When people see something in their social media feed, you know this because you're all on social media, your response is not, whoa, I can't believe that's true. Your response is, I wonder if that's true. I mean, that's how I react to social media. Raise your hand if that's how you react to seeing something on social media. Yeah, right? Like, no, people are not stupid, but in the media, journalists love to think that we're so much smarter than everybody and everyone else. Anytime they open TikTok and they see some guy, right, those shaky TikTok videos, like, this is what just happened in the White House, that every other person is a rube, is like, oh my God, look what just happened in the White House. They're not. They're looking at a 22-year-old talking about what's happening in the White House. They're like, I wonder if that's true. So to me, there's a little bit of hysteria. Like, I think that there's not enough misinformation out there.
What?
Like, there's this hysteria around misinformation that is created by people who think they should have the authority to tell everybody what to think and what to value and what to believe. And they cannot stand the idea that people are actually saying no and producing their own meaning on the same places that we inhabit. I mean, we're supposed to be the people telling you what to think. So to me, there's like a little bit of hysteria around this like whole question of like, and plus the free speech thing, like people go to these places to do the thing that makes us American and the thing that makes this the best country on the planet. Like they go there to speak freely. And yeah, it's terrifying, this idea that we would be living under European speech codes where you could go to prison for like saying the wrong thing. I mean, it's really crazy. So I'm a little bit of a skeptic about
Understood,
this.
but I think we have to dial back to there isn't enough, we need more misinformation.
Well, Jack,
Ms. Cupp might have a little something to say about
I'm having a heart attack right now. No, I mean, I get where you're going, mostly. But I think we all know lots of people, Dad, who do use social media and do not question what they see.
Correct.
If we didn't, conspiracy theories would be in the basement and the fringes and not in Congress. So the conspiracy theory thing is real, and that's because enough people don't go, let me double check that. Let me see if that's a real thing. Let me look for the facts in this shaky video by a 20-year-old. I agree, lots of people do, but too many people don't. And I certainly would never wish for more misinformation, or certainly disinformation for anyone.
I think all Americans, most Americans would agree that when Alex Jones fomented over a long period of time the notion that Newtown was a hoax and subjected those families to the kind of abuse that was heaped upon them, that's not a public good in any way. That's something I think we can all agree is terrible, and we would have a better country and a better world if there was a way to deal with that. I don't know what.
Yeah, but the question is, what do you mean by deal with it? Does a private company, would the moral thing in that moment have? First of all, they don't care about morality, right? YouTube took that down because they knew they would not be able to post ads on it and that there would be a bigger backlash. What I mean by more disinformation is like, so what do we call it when the former head of the CIA is corralled, and I know you agree with me about this, by the way, is corralled by the Biden administration to corral 50 former intelligence and current intelligence people to say that a laptop is Russian disinformation when actually it belongs to the president's son, or the front runner for the Democratic nomination's son, right? That was misinformation, but they called it Russian disinformation, and that is the thing that I'm talking about here, which is that there is an elite that has decided that they get to make that call, And I think that the American people at some point, like, we don't have more of a First Amendment right than they do, and the experts have lied to them. And so,
yeah, but I think you're creating a false choice.
Let me just make the point.
Between free speech and censorship, and there's something in the middle.
The point being that a lot of what has been sold to them as the standard for calling out disinformation turned out to actually be misinformation.
Right.
And that is why conspiracy theories are on the rise, because of a failure of expertise, not because of a failure of censorship.
So, McKenna, what do you make of this particular part of it?
Yeah, I'm making a lot of this. Actually, a little bit of an anecdote. I was on TikTok this week. We all got that emergency alert, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was on TikTok. Do you know how many people I saw putting devices in tinfoil in their microwaves? To talk about, no, literally, it was scattered all across my For You page. To talk about people not questioning things, I do think it's both, right?
Bunch of things not
I
enough.
can't believe I didn't do that. Like,
But we can talk about speech. I think speech itself we can debate about speech. That is very, to the heart of what it is to live in this country.
Right.
But what is getting scary? You brought up AI earlier. What about fake stuff? Deep fake videos, synthetic audio. We actually saw this week, I read a story in Wired about the Slovakian election, where 3 days before the election takes place, there's a moratorium on the candidates talking to the media, right? Mm-hmm. Well, 3 days ahead of the election, synthetic audio went on Facebook, and it was one of the candidates made to sound like he was saying that he was going to ban beer. And of course you can question that, but when it's something that sounds exactly like the person, we have heard, the synthetic audio before. I think we're getting into scarier territory when it comes to things that are actually fake and being able to disclose, whether or not, I think Facebook does a very good job about having that little note at the bottom to be like, this is probably synthetic audio. I think more of that needs to happen.
Right.
The community notes on Twitter/X, I think that's a really great solution as well.
And I know that there is the ability to label photography that's been altered, video that's been
Right.
altered, audio that's been altered, and not all of the platforms are accepting to use those
Yeah.
labels, right? I believe TikTok is.
Yeah, so there's actually part of the Biden administration, they had this big AI summit recently. And a part of that was OpenAI, Meta, all these companies basically agreeing that we're going to find a way to watermark content that was falsely generated on our platforms. That way it's probably included in the metadata, so when it gets posted on these platforms, it'll have some kind of disclosure like we've seen before. And I think seeing more of that would be good. But also, Essie, you mentioned earlier about enforcement.
Yeah.
Enforcement is the problem. And I don't know if that's a whole nother question about whether or not we're going to bring government into that. But for the platforms to enforce their policies to the best of their abilities, especially
John,
when
you
we're
wanted to
entering
say
this
something
era.
about that?
Yeah, I just want to, about Meta and misinformation in a couple of different ways. And so let's go back to the pandemic. January 30th, 2020 is a big date in human history. And so you had the problem almost immediately is that there were going to be statements on Facebook about the virus and about the whole business. And there was a decision made very quickly that they would take down material that was false and that caused harm. And by harm, they meant spreading the virus more so than it would have otherwise, right? So in the early days, if you said, for example, that it's no worse than the flu, or it can't be spread by being out in public, or you shouldn't practice social distancing and so on. And then in later days, it was anti-vax, if you anything that discouraged people from getting vaccinated. So eventually, they published online, and it's still there, I think, 80 separate propositions that would get you taken down immediately if they appeared on the platform. So they went out and searched and got good at searching for those propositions. So you had a public statement of what falsehood was, which is kind of ironic because anyone remember when Facebook said they didn't want to be the arbiter of truth? They ended up being sort of the arbiter of truth because you have to ask the question, who decides what's false? And it turned out the answer was the CDC and more so the World Health Organization. So when they didn't know the answer, they went to the CDC And sort of the Biden administration intervention, I think, grew out of that. So all of that worked pretty well because a lot of those propositions were on the, after the vaccination, were on the level of, well, if you take this, if you get vaccinated, your body will become magnetic. And it had these photos of, you know, forks going up and hitting people. So, okay, I think we can live with that. But one of them was, for 3 months, that saying the origin, there was a non-natural, a lab origin of the virus, was hate speech, right? And so for about 3 months, it was on the list. And then, and this is kind of, I mean, the Facebook thing, so that's a bad thing. But they did put it back, they took it off that list. And you could say it afterwards. The only question, so that's great. They learned, you know, they went through time and they found out something. The problem is they did it just about the time that the Biden administration said, and certain federal agencies said, you know, there might be something to this.
Yeah.
So it wasn't clear that they made the decision on their own. The great danger of misinformation is once you get away from objective harm, violence, or people getting really harmed in very concrete and very causally specific ways, then you're going to be talking, the danger of misusing it. I already see in the public, there's this notion, instead of you're talking about somebody saying a falsehood, and you're talking about misinformation or disinformation, what you're going to end up with, remember the polarization issue? The two parties don't say, you know, the Republicans or the Democrats, they have these ideas and I disagree with them, but you know, it's all right. What they say is that's a lie. Everything is a lie. So everything's going to become a lie. That's the possibility of the abuse of misinformation, even if you can come up with a sort of incitement idea, is just enormous, right. Just enormous.
So we only have a few minutes left, I'm sorry to say, because I think we could go on for another hour. But I'm going to posit a question and then go right down the line here if we can get a brief answer. And that is, we know that the freedoms we enjoy in this country come with a price in all sorts of ways. There are risks and dangers that come from certain freedoms that we hold sacred. But if we have a perception, as I think some people do in this country, that democracy itself is in more danger than it has been in a while, and that democracy needs defending. And we do put some restrictions on how we conduct our democracy. And we also know that there are, the world is rife with examples of autocrats who have used the tools of democratic regimes to achieve autocracy. So I guess what I'm asking, what I'd like you to think about is, if you could wave a wand today in the boardrooms of TikTok, or I guess X doesn't have a boardroom anymore, but Facebook or Instagram, Meta, what would you have them do to change to better defend the processes that we all hold dear in a democracy?
Yeah, I mean, I wish from these first studies we had come out with something and we had said, oh, look, if you tamp down on reshares during the course of an election, that will make people hate each other less. But what we found was there are not any, so far, simple solutions to these kind of very complex issues that are facing society here today. What I would change, and I go back, and I think, thanks for, you know, this is the thing that I talk about all the time, right? Like, it's hard to make good policy based on anecdote. And if there's like one thing to take away from this here, is that you should remember social media are huge and they're optimized for search, which means it's possible to find evidence of anything. You want to point to something, you want to say something is out there, you can always find it because it's probably out there. And there are search tools that allow you to do this. But that makes it much harder to figure out what's happening at scale, to figure out things like denominators, to figure out trends over time, and to figure out actual causal relationships, what's causing things. So, this is not going to be surprising coming from the academic on the panel, but if I could wave a wand, I want the public, all of us, to have better information with which to couch these arguments, and our policymakers, who may have very different understandings of what they think the solutions are, but I would hope that everyone would agree on both sides of the aisle that they want better quality information about what's happening on these platforms and what are the impacts of these choices that the platforms are making, so that we as the public can come to reasoned positions on these things, not based on anecdote, but based on rigorous scientific understanding of what's happening there. So I think that, to me, access and making it possible to do this kind of research at scale is what sort of the prime mover of all of this. This is the first step we need to be able to answer these questions you've been trying to ask us tonight.
McKenna.
I'm sure it's unsurprising that I feel the exact same way as a journalist. But yeah, I think about the things that Facebook and Twitter, all these platforms have done that for me has been a boon as a journalist. I go back to the 2018 election when I think it was Amy Klobuchar and maybe other couple lawmakers were pressuring for some kind of database to see what is going on with all these political ads. You know, where are they? Who are they being shown to? And now we have a Facebook, Instagram ads database that we can easily use, search, see how much money is going behind these ads. Google has one as well. That transparency has been wonderful for me, you know, to cross-check it with FEC databases, to do all this stuff. So if I had to wave a wand, I want more of that on like how the algorithms are being built, more information on, you know, how people are using the platform. And of course, you know, how that plays out, if it's the FTC all of a sudden gets millions more dollars and has access to it and can actually do something, that'd be great. But yeah, no, I would want more transparency for sure.
Dan.
Yeah, I mentioned Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act earlier. That was passed 20 years ago. And it was, and I just got my first job working on the Hill, and I kept on hearing these members of Congress say, we have to nurture and protect the internet while it's in its infancy. That was the whole basis of shielding these internet companies from liability, so that they could then censor without concern of being sued, or not censor and still not be sued. Since then, we now have Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple, the four largest publicly traded corporations in world history. These four combined, their market capitalization would make them together the fourth largest country in the world based on GDP. These companies are not in their infancy, yet they are free to censor speech. What would I do? I would say, and I think I'm parroting what John said, but in a Dan Schneider kind of way. Don't censor constitutionally protected speech. If it is incitement to violence, if it's actually, an enemy from abroad using false narratives to attack our democracy, there are things that are not constitutionally protected. But if it's constitutionally protected, let it go.
Okay. Batya?
So you won't be surprised to hear this, but I feel very, like when I look at this question, I'm amazed that despite the billions and billions of dollars that these social media companies have invested trying to make us hate each other, they've totally failed, right? Americans do not hate each other. They hate the media and they hate their political parties, which they should. So I don't feel that I need a magic wand. I think that the fears for our democracy, if you pay close attention, they often come right after somebody lost an election, a fair election, on both sides. So I don't feel at all convinced that our democracy is in jeopardy. I think it's never been more robust. You see it standing up to challenges all the time. What I would say is there actually is a social media company that was a foreign export from our greatest foreign adversary, which is TikTok, which is basically a Chinese psyop, which was exported to destroy our children and their minds and make them completely addicted, which they are, and we should ban TikTok. I mean, there's absolutely no excuse for having a piece of spyware in the hands of 150 million Americans. But as far as I'm concerned, that is in a totally different realm than any of the other companies.
And it's interesting, that point was made by one of the candidates at the Republican debate right before Fox cut to a TikTok
yes, a
commercial.
TikTok ad, correct, yes, correct.
John.
So I would focus on a couple of things. One about the United States. Remember my public choice orientation. Does something really work? So this is actually a conversation about Donald Trump, isn't it? So let's just say that. Facebook, as I said, deprived him of access to his account, and did so for about 2 years. During that period, let's just say you believe that he represents a threat to democracy. Did he become more popular, less popular, stay about the same? That the problem you're facing is very complex one, I think, was because what Facebook did and the Oversight Board did actually strengthened, or it certainly didn't weaken him at all. So when you have authorities doing stuff like that to people who are saying that the elites are corrupt to begin with, the response, at least in Trump's case, and he may be unique, is that his supporters believe him, right? The other point I would make, that is the one I've learned on the Oversight Board, which is Facebook or Meta claims about 200 million users in the United States and 3 billion worldwide. So it's far less than 10%, maybe 6% of Meta's platform is in the United States. And many, many of the problems of content moderation that Meta has exist abroad. And I do think the experience early in the history of Meta, relatively early, in Burma, in nearly being caught up in a mass murder, was profound for the culture of the company. And they come across this all the time. People, I mean, they removed the Prime Minister of Cambodia, which was a big thing when you think about it, because he gave a speech. People go to these 3-hour speeches in which, about every 10 minutes, he says he's got to use a baseball bat on his opponents. I mean, you come across that all the time. This speech in the United States, we sort of we have a very, very demanding incitement to violence. It's very hard. Donald Trump did not incite violence legally on January 6th. He would have been indicted for that. But it's a very difficult thing. In other parts of the world, what's said on social media is not just threatens democracy, there may not be democracy, it threatens lives, and it could threaten lots of lives. You could be giving the means to kill lots of people, basically. And so that, in a sense, I think, and I also think my impression of Meta is that goes to the top of their priority list. Because they don't want to kill people. They're not monsters or something. They don't want that, but it's also be terrible for the company if they got caught up in something like that.
S.E., last word to you.
Well, I don't think I'd wave a magic wand at the boardrooms of social media companies. I might wave a magic wand at the wave of political populism that came through my party that told people to distrust science and facts and experts and journalists, which I think is deeply corrosive, making you distrustful of experts, people who know stuff, academics, scientists, science facts, journalists, I think is really deleterious, because then it makes you skeptical of everything, and it makes you very conspiratorial. It deepens the distrust that I think does not represent where most Americans are. It deepens that, and it deepens the perception that we have enemies in all of these democratic institutions. And then I might wave a magic wand at this idea that we have no agency as consumers or users or what you want to call us, products. I get what you're saying too completely. But we do. I hear this all the time. Social media, I want social media to make their products safer for my kids. Why don't you're the parent, I'm the parent, I'm a parent. I'll make my kids' experience as safe as I want it to be. That's my job and my responsibility. Social media, make news better for me to consume. Well, you have choices in everything you watch and everything you read. And I think we've become so passive in our experiences that we want to blame everyone else. We all have agency. We can demand better. I say this as someone in cable news. I think a product that is really broken, and we do it because we're supply and demand. If y'all wanted C-SPAN, we'd act a lot more like C-SPAN, I promise. But most cable news viewers want Hannity and Tucker and Rachel, or name it, name the primetime hosts, at cable news networks. You're not demanding C-SPAN. So, I mean, a lot of this is on us and not companies and institutions and certainly not the government. This is on us. The world is what we make of it. We deserve the products that we get and the experience that we get. It doesn't mean that science shouldn't involve itself and figure out how to make things better. It doesn't mean that corporations shouldn't ask themselves, how can we make this better? And it doesn't mean that people shouldn't question everything. Of course we should. But this is in our hands. And if we don't get smarter at this, if we don't take more personal responsibility for this, everything's just going to happen around us, and we're going to find ourselves wondering, God, how did that happen?
Well spoke. Well, in the words of cable news hosts everywhere, we have to leave it there.
At the end of the day.
At the end of the day. But I want to thank our panel for a terrific conversation. Thank you.
So I just want to say, wow, that was really fruitful and insightful. Thank you all for joining tonight. Thank you all to our esteemed panel. That was just a really important conversation. It is our hope that these types of conversations, these discussions bring new insight, I think they did, a new perspective into media's impact on society. I especially want to thank Jim for your support always, and to your wife as well. This is a very meaningful series, a very meaningful conversation. I hope that you've all enjoyed it, and come back. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.